Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're exploring one of the strangest and most debated mysteries in the world of lost civilizations, the story of Lemuria. What was it supposed to be? A continent that vanished beneath the Indian Ocean? The home of an ancient, advanced civilization? Or simply a 19th century scientific theory that grew into a legend? We'll look at where the idea of Lemuria began, how scientists once believed in a missing continent to explain ancient fossils, and how that idea slowly transformed into a myth about a forgotten world. Along the way, we'll explore the stories, the supposed evidence, and the fascination that still surrounds this lost land today. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to wander through the mysteries of history, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. The rooms of the Zoological Society at Hanover Square had the reassuring smell of paper and polish, as if knowledge itself gave off a scent. It was a good place for a careful mind to make a bold proposal. In the spring of 1864, Philip Lutley Sclater sat surrounded by skins, bones, and maps. A zoologist by training and temperament, who cherished order but could tolerate a little daring where the evidence allowed. Sclater was not a showman. He was a cataloguer, a patient man of lists and regions, the sort who believed that if you divided the world correctly, you might one day understand it. When he proposed that a great land once stretched across the Indian Ocean, linking Madagascar with India and perhaps the islands beyond, it was not to thrill the newspapers. It was to solve a problem that had been bothering him for years. Why did Madagascar and parts of southern Asia share curious affinities among the most ancient of primates, while the mainland of Africa did not seem to hold the same key? Where had these creatures come from, and how had they reached their separate homes? To understand the mind at work, one has to know a bit about the man. Sclater had been trained at Oxford in classics and law before turning decisively to natural history. He became secretary of the Zoological Society of London and would hold that post for more than 3 decades. A fixture of British science who wrote with economy and sharpness. In 1858, 6 years before his Lemuria paper, he had already imposed order on the living world by dividing the globe into 6 zoological regions. The names he chose still shape textbooks: Nertic, Neotropical, Ethiopian, Palarctic, Indian, and Australasian. Behind those tidy names lay a great deal of travel, letter writing, and the patient sorting of facts. Sclater knew from experience that boundaries in nature are seldom straight lines. They are zones of mingling and sharp breaks that follow seas and mountains. His eye was trained to find patterns among scattered dots. The scattered dots that concerned him in 1864 were lemurs. The word itself carries a story. In the 18th century, Linnaeus gave the name to a group of nocturnal primates whose large eyes and grave silence struck him as otherworldly. He borrowed a Latin word used by the Romans for restless spirits who wandered the night: lemures. By the 19th century, European naturalists had learned that living lemurs were not spirits at all, but a diverse clan confined to Madagascar and the nearby Comoros, with far-flung cousins among the lorises of India and Sri Lanka and the Galagos of mainland Africa. The whole tribe belonged to the old and branching family of the strepsirrhine primates. Behind their bright eyes and moist noses lay a deep ancestry that pushed back toward the earliest primates of the Eocene. This was where the puzzle opened. The living lemurs were confined to one large island in the Indian Ocean and a few islets. Yet echoes of their clan appeared in southern Asia and Africa. Madagascar contained a profusion of lemurs unmatched anywhere else on Earth. From the long-armed Indri that calls across forest canopy like a flute, to the strange eye that hunts grubs with a finger as thin as a twig. Naturalists in the 19th century also knew of lorises in India and Ceylon and in the Malay world, and of bush babies and potos upon the African mainland. The distributions did not line up neatly with Sclater's regions. They suggested an older geography, a time when what is now ocean had been land, and when animals could wander where today only water lies. Sclater gathered his observations and wrote his paper, published in the Quarterly Journal of Science, under the plain title that concealed its significance: The Mammals of Madagascar. He compared lists. He weighed affinities. He was not looking to write an epic. He was looking to explain a data set. What he proposed followed a respectable tradition of his century. If two living lands hold closely related species that are unlikely to have crossed great storms and salt water, then those lands were likely once connected. The mechanism by which they became separated was unknown. Men like Lyell had argued that the crust of the earth changes slowly, that seas creep and land slowly rises or subsides. Darwin had proposed that coral atolls form over sinking volcanic islands, which was itself a mild lesson in how islands can appear ancient and then disappear beneath the tide line. No one in 1864 had the language of plates or spreading ridges. When Sclater reached for an explanation, he took what his era offered: a land bridge, not everywhere and forever, but for long enough to allow living things to move. The step from a modest land bridge to a continent was not so large as it sounds to modern ears. The Indian Ocean was then a space of weak knowledge and strong conjecture. Mariner charts showed shallow banks and round ridges, the Mascarenes with their volcanic peaks and basalt shores, the Syedamala Bank and the Nazareth Bank where soundings ran up suddenly from deep water to broad shoals. Naturalists and navigators understood that islands can be the surviving tips of larger structures. Sclater's leap was to treat these hints as the remains of something continental. In naming that something, his instinct for tidy classification served him once again. He borrowed from the animals that had forced the question: Lemuria, a land of lemurs. In the manner of Victorian science, the name was both descriptive and grand. The paper did not read like a romance. It read like a memo from a man who wanted his colleagues to look again at their maps. It concluded that the simplest way to explain the distribution of the old primates and certain other animals and plants was to restore a path of land from Madagascar through the Laccadives and Maldives, and perhaps onward to the Malay Islands, or even to Australia. If one restored such a path, the creatures made sense. They could have moved in deep time, then been stranded when the seas returned to their basins. It was one explanation among several, but it had the advantage of aligning many scattered facts without inventing a dozen smaller causes. The world into which this idea entered was noisy with argument. Darwin's origin had been out for 5 years. T.H. Huxley had publicly taken up the cause, boxing with bishops and with caution. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, had returned from the Malay archipelago with notebooks full of birds and butterflies, and with a map of his own drawn in the sea between Bali and Lombok. The Wallace Line, as it would come to be called by others, marked a divide in the animal world between Asia and Australia so sharp that it suggested deep water and ancient separation. Wallace took from his islands a reverence for the power of sea channels to stop the spread of life. Where Sclater found a comfort in land bridges, Wallace found a stern teacher in currents and depth. The debate between these ways of seeing was not a matter of personalities. It was a matter of habit and experience. Each man had gathered evidence in his own way, and brought it home. In this circus of new ideas, Lemuria had the look of a proposition that would either shrink with time or grow tendrils into larger stories. It did both. Among the most influential readers of Sclater's work was a German biologist with a gift for grand syntheses. Ernst Haeckel found in Lemuria not only a path for animals but a cradle for us. He would later argue that the unknown ancestor of mankind had dwelt in the warm reaches of a vanished southern land. That story belongs to another chapter. In the first years, the focal question remained the modest one Sclater had posed. Could 10,000 square miles of ocean once have been corridors of dry land and forest? If so, when? If not, why do living things tell a story of family across the waves? Victorian readers did not live only on papers and meetings. They lived on voyages. In 1872, the Royal Navy sent out a 3-masted corvette to study the depths of the sea. The voyage of the Challenger would change the study of ocean basins. The vessel zigzagged through the Atlantic, then around the Cape and into the Indian Ocean, then onward through the Pacific and home by way of the Strait of Magellan. Sailors paid out sounding lines and dredges, hauled up ooze and manganese nodules, measured temperature and salinity, and kept watch for the flicker of life at unimagined depths. In the Indian Ocean, the crew recorded banks and ridges, submerged forms that seemed to suggest the drowned bones of continents. They also recorded great tracts of very deep water. The seafloor was not a uniform plain but a country of mountains and trenches. The Challenger proved beyond argument that the bottom of the sea is not a featureless waste. Yet the new maps did not settle Sclater's question. They gave ammunition to both sides. If there are great ridges, one can argue that they might be the remains of sunken land. If there are abysses, one can argue that no land bridge ever crossed them in the age of mammals. A map does not settle a story. It sets the stage for better questions. Meanwhile, knowledge of Madagascar itself was deepening in a way that made the island even more tantalizing. French naturalist Alfred Grandidier spent years in the field cataloguing its fauna and flora and set in motion the monumental Histoire naturelle de Madagascar, which would run to dozens of volumes and involve many hands. The more Madagascar was known, the stranger it seemed. Here were entire families of animals absent from mainland Africa. The lemurs in their astonishing variety, tenrecs that looked like hedgehogs but were not, Malagasy carnivores that were cousins of civets but had taken a path of their own. Even the plants told the same tale of isolation and experiment. Any person who hunted for causes would be forgiven for banning chance and insisting on a previous age when borders were different. As the new facts accumulated, Sclater's concept drew commentary. Many accepted the idea in part. Others accepted the pattern but doubted the mechanism. A land bridge is a neat phrase that conceals its own questions. Why would the sea have retreated to reveal such a bridge? And when did it return? Was the bridge a continuous continent or a scattered archipelago of large islands? If animals crossed, why did so few large African mammals reach Madagascar? Why did giraffes and antelopes and big cats not populate the island if the way was once open? These questions were not asked maliciously. They were the marks of a culture that had grown more rigorous since the great voyages that discovered new continents for Europe. Inquiry had matured. If one wanted to alter a map, one had to answer objections. It was at this point that the older language of land bridges began to mingle with newer investigations of ancient climates and plant distributions. Austrian geologist Eduard Suess examined the spread of the fossil plant Glossopteris in the southern continents. and proposed that the lands of the south had once formed a single mass. He called it Gondwana land. In his thinking, great continents had risen and fallen in vertical movements of the crust that created and then erased shallow seas. He did not imagine continents as moving sideways, yet his name and his insistence on a single southern expanse were powerful contributions. They gave a framework in which Sclater's thought no longer stood alone. If a grand southern land had once existed, then a connection between Madagascar and India was not fantasy. It was a local expression of a larger truth. In London, the scientific conversation moved back and forth between careful particular studies and large bridging ideas. Joseph Dalton Hooker, the botanist who had sailed with Ross to the Antarctic and had become one of Darwin's closest friends, traced the deep kinships of southern plant floras. He showed that plants could testify to old geographies as convincingly as animals. Through this period, Sclater read and argued and catalogued. He remained the secretary who kept the ledgers, but he was also the quiet architect of a set of insisting questions that would drive inquiry for decades. Lemuria did more than stir learned journals. It entered the newspapers and the dinner tables. Lost land makes for a good story in any century. In the 1880s, Ignatius Donnelly would make a popular theater of the older story of Atlantis and sell books by the tens of thousands. Lemuria did not have Plato's authority behind it, but it had something even more seductive to a Victorian public that loved science. It had the tone of a modern investigation. It came wrapped in the earnest modesty of a man who loved birds and maps. In coffee houses and parlors, one could refer to Lemuria as if one had attended the meeting and taken notes beside the zoologists. The name, with its soft consonants, was borrowed from a primate but sounded like a place from a travel book, half Latin, half lullaby. The charm of the idea reached far beyond London. In Germany, France, and the United States, naturalists and geographers who wrestled with their own map problems found in Lemuria a handy term, a placeholder for missing land. Scholars of animal migration, students of languages, compilers of folklore, even a few learned men who had slipped from sober study into a taste for the marvelous, all tried Lemuria on like a coat and found that it suited their purposes. When the French asserted growing interests in the Western Indian Ocean and later colonized Madagascar, some of their writers warmed to Lemuria as if to a family romance. If the sea had indeed swallowed a southern world, perhaps the modern French mission bore a faint resemblance to a rescue. One sees in the journals of the time a casual mingling of scientific thought and imperial assumptions that now can make the reader wince. Victorians and their continental counterparts often believed that to explain was to assign stewardship. At the same time, there was resistance. Wallace, with his stern love of deep channels, preferred other explanations. He had watched with his own eyes as islands divided by narrow but deep straits held entirely different birds and beasts. He trusted water to do more than people allowed. If lemur-like primates were in Madagascar and Asia, he wanted to know what the currents could and could not do. It was not that Wallace thought Sclater foolish. It was that Wallace's field experience made him reject easy bridges that ran across gulfs he had learned to respect. He and Sclater did not duel in print so much as they circled one another warily, admiring the other's work, unconvinced by the other's habit of mind. While the arguments wound on, a quieter revolution was underway in the tacit assumptions of their world. In geology and physics, a few voices were beginning to suspect that continents might do something other than rise and fall. They might drift. The idea would not be made public with force until a meteorologist named Alfred Wegener presented his case in the second decade of the next century. It would not be widely accepted for another half-century, but the mood of science was already changing in the 1860s and 70s. Oceanographers were discovering ridges and trenches. Paleontologists were filling drawers with new fossils that altered family trees. The age of the Earth seemed to lengthen each year as physicists sharpened their methods. In such a climate, an idea like Lemuria could take root because it was provisional, brave enough to explain but humble enough to be replaced if a better explanation arrived. Madagascar, for its part, continued to supply astonishments that kept the question open. Subfossil remains of enormous lemurs, far larger than any living species, turned up in caves and ancient lake beds. There had been lemurs that stood as tall as a man, and others that moved heavily on the ground like strange forest pigs, and an arboreal raft of forms that suggested a long and separate experiment. The island had been a world of primates before people reached it in the last several thousand years and altered its forests and hunted its giants. Each new skull or limb bone seemed to whisper the same message. This place has been cut off long enough to rewrite a chapter of the Book of Mammals. To scholars at a distance, the simplest picture remained a bridge gone missing. That picture grew more elaborate as scholars tried to match the distributions of other families. Cicadas, the ancient songmakers of trees, showed echoes between India and Madagascar. Some beetles and butterflies did as well, though the details were treacherous and easily misread. Certain plant families were spread across southern Africa, Madagascar, and India in patterns that seemed to beg for ancient contact. The evidence was not a chain so much as a scattered fleet of rafts. One could imagine rafts drifting across storm seas on uprooted trees and mats of vegetation, carrying small animals. Such events were known to occur. One could also imagine ridges and stepping stone islands where migrants could rest and breed before moving onward. Sclater preferred the second picture because it granted the animals the dignity of a path. Others admitted both. The British scientific press published letters and short notes in which travelers, missionaries, and planters sent home rumors of reefs and shoals that rose out of the sea in long lines, as if part of old coastlines. The oceans then were still full of mystery. The bottom was not yet charted. The imagination drew maps in the blank spaces. It is tempting to imagine Sclater at his desk in the winter season in London, with the lamps lit early and fog at the windows, turning a fossil tooth in his fingers and weighing once again the simple sentence that had made such a noise. There had been a land. He had named it Lemuria for the creatures that made him ask. He could not prove that the sea had swallowed it entire. He could not draw a timeline for its appearance and disappearance. He could only insist that the pattern of life suggested connections that the modern map did not display. That was the modest strength of his position and its permanent charm. It invited others to go out and look, to measure depths, to read the chemistry of old rocks, to track island birds, to ponder the restless nature of the earth. The claim, delicate as it was, had consequences far beyond the tidy rows of the Zoological Society library. In the years after Sclater named his continent, antiquarians and spiritual seekers would attach their own embroidery to it. Nationalists would borrow it to write myths of origin. Writers of romance would people it with tall figures and hidden cities. But in that first moment, the idea had the clean lines of a diagram. An island crowded with ancient primates and a mainland with their cousins. Shoals and banks that ran like broken causeways beneath a widely spread ocean. A man with a mind for regions giving the world a name that joined those facts together. There is a tendency when a legend grows large to forget its modest beginnings. If one strips away the later accretions, the egg-laying giants and the subterranean cities, and the preaching of adepts on mountain flanks, one still finds Sclater's question remaining stubbornly at the center. Why do the living things of Madagascar and southern Asia look related in ways that insist on older geography? It is by following this question backward, through the lectures and notes and the argumentative letters, that the historian can rescue Lemuria from the noise. Not to restore it as a geological fact, for that will become another chapter's work, but to understand how a careful Victorian drew a line through uncertain water because the animals told him he must. It is a simple and beautiful thing to watch a mind choose the dignity of pattern over the fear of being wrong. In the late afternoons, when the society emptied and the porters tidied away the day's instruments, it would have been possible to walk from Hanover Square down to the river and watch the city's lights find themselves in the water. London in those years was a place of surfaces that hid deeper moving currents. In the lecture rooms and smoking clubs, men of science were teaching themselves to read those currents as if they were words. Sclater had added a word to that growing language, and it had the quality of a key. Whether it opened the right door would be for others to test on voyages that were then being planned. The lecture hall at Jena was made for proclamations. It had a fondness for certainty. Tiered benches and tall windows, chalk dust hanging in the air like fog on a river, and a professor whose voice could ride the room from wall to wall. Ernst Haeckel knew how to fill such a space. He had the air of a man who had seen into the machinery of life and could now point out its levers and counterweights as easily as a botanist might name the parts of a flower. In the years after Darwin published his argument, Haeckel became one of its great heralds on the continent. He was the figure who could make new ideas feel older than they were by giving them the dignity of a system and the drama of a genealogy. He loved trees, not the leafy kind only, but the branching diagrams that turn a scattered creation into a single family that reaches backward into time. From his desk in Jena, Haeckel read the English journals with attention. He knew Sclater's paper and the plea it carried for a vanished land. He did not dwell long in the cautious house of land bridges. His imagination moved toward first origins. Darwin had set the terms. Natural selection had replaced the fixity of species with a restless history. Yet Darwin could be careful to the point of reticence about human beginnings. Haeckel was not built for reticence. He wished to say where the first true men had stood and how they had spread. He wished to draw a map that would make sense of languages and skulls and the sudden appearance of human artifacts across the old world. He had two influences that worked upon him in this enterprise. One was the old German tradition of nataphilosophy, a habit of mind that looked for grand patterns and law-like forms beneath the clutter of data. The other was a new faith in historical method. Haeckel believed that the development of life had a story that could be reconstructed through careful inference from embryology, morphology, and distribution. He was the man who insisted that the history of the individual embryo might echo, in faint and distorted ways, the history of the species. Ontogeny recapitulates. Phylogeny was a phrase that would carry his name into many debates. Even when critics disputed the formula, the ambition behind it was irresistible. Nature was a narrative, and with enough evidence one could read it chapter by chapter. When he arrived at the chapter of humankind, the available fossils were poor guides. No Neanderthal skull had yet entered common discussion when Haeckel began to form his views. No hand axes had been anchored to ages by methods that could satisfy his need for chronology. He did what good schematizers often do. He built a scaffold out of what he knew best, and then he reached for what he called the missing forms, to fill the gaps that were visible to his mind, if not to his museum drawers. He gave names to those missing forms, so that they might become more real in the scientific conversation. Pithecanthropus allalus, the speechless ape man, was one such invention. He did not know where its bones would be found. He trusted that they existed. For the homeland, he preferred the warmth of the south. Haeckel's map of creation placed a garden of first things in a band that ran through the Indian Ocean world. To him, the simplest way to reconcile the similarities of primates across Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia was to restore a lost platform of land and to bless that platform with the first appearance of human form. The name that Sclater had used was available and ready for service. Lemuria, a word borrowed from lemurs, became, in Haeckel's writing, a stage for the first acts of our species. He could be specific in a way that was more poetic than precise. In one plate he labeled a central area paradise, not in the theological sense, but as a shorthand for the place where the human line crossed the threshold into what we would one day call ourselves. There were reasons for this southern preference beyond the allure of warm seas. Haeckel argued that the earliest men would have required a climate that did not demand too much invention, that early creatures who had only just stood upright and barely learned to shape tools would have found life easier near the equator. He also thought in terms of radiations outward. If one wishes to explain how human cultures and types spread across Eurasia and Africa, it helps to begin from a point that can reach both directions with a minimum of obstacles. A land that touches India on one side and Africa on the other, with a span through island chains that lead toward the Pacific, offers exactly that convenience. In an era before continental drift, a vanished southern continent provided a cleaner narrative than migrations across open ocean. Haeckel's lecture courses and books brought these ideas to an audience that wanted stories as much as it wanted numbers. The History of Creation was a title that could sit on a parlor table and announce itself with confidence. Inside, the prose had certainty and a friendliness to the non-specialist that made it easy to carry into conversation. In those pages, the family tree of humanity unrolled like a medieval genealogy, with archaic forms receding into a haze as branches ran toward the south. The lines that rose out of Lemuria led toward Asia and Africa, and finally fanned out as if to populate the map his readers already knew. He had a gift for driving students outward to test his claims. One such student by influence, if not by formal instruction, was a Dutch physician named Eugene Dubois. Dubois was a restless man who did not like to sit still while others argued. He read Haeckel and absorbed the conviction that the missing form must be found in the Indies, somewhere in that archipelago that seemed to hang like a necklace from the Asian shore. He secured a military post in the Netherlands East Indies in order to place himself where he could hunt for bones. On the banks of the Solo River in Java in 1891 and 1892, he found fragments that would be spoken of in newspapers around the world. A skull cap with a low vault, a femur that spoke of a creature that walked upright. Dubois called it Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. He brought the pieces to Europe and showed them in lecture after lecture to rooms that had Haeckel's voice still echoing in their woodwork. It is important to pause on this thread, not to claim more for it than it can carry, but to see how an idea can rearrange the furniture of an entire generation. If Haeckel had not insisted on the southern and eastern lands, Dubois might have hunted elsewhere. If Dubois had not found what he found, Haeckel's speechless man would have remained too airy a device to persuade many minds. The discovery in Java gave a physical anchor to a set of theories that had been floating for want of weight. It did not prove Lemuria in any literal way. It did, however, give great comfort to those who had placed the cradle of humankind somewhere nearer the Indian Ocean than the savannas of Africa. Haeckel did not argue in an empty field. There were other giants on that ground. Thomas Huxley had written on the relation between man and the great apes and had the combative sense to defend evolution in public. Alfred Wallace, who had seen with his own eyes the dividing line in the Malay archipelago where Asiatic and Australian creatures parted ways, brought a stern appreciation for the power of deep channels to limit the spread of species. Wallace was more cautious about the ease with which land could appear and disappear. He could admit a southern continent in deep time and still insist that the modern ocean basins were old shapes that had to be respected. The conversation between Haeckel and Wallace was not a set of personal letters so much as a set of public positions that readers could move between as they formed their own opinions. There was also Darwin himself, watchful and precise. He had suggested Africa as a likely origin for the human line, thinking of the living great apes and what their kinship might imply. His suggestion was modest. He did not assert it as a conclusion. Haeckel preferred Asia and the southern seas, and he said so with a confidence that made his readers feel that a map had been corrected rather than proposed. The contrast between the two men was instructive. Darwin could be content with a preponderance of evidence and a carefully phrased hypothesis. Haeckel wanted a story one could follow from page to page, without the hesitations that slow a reader and make a thesis harder to carry in the mind. As the century turned, Haeckel's systems had begun to reach beyond the academy into the bloodstream of popular culture. His trees of life were reproduced in journals and school books. His way of thinking about races as branches with older and younger forms attached to larger trunks seeped into conversations about history and politics. Some took from his language a justification for ranking people in a hierarchy that had very little to do with science and a great deal to do with the ambitions and fears of empires. It is one of the ironies of the age that a mind devoted to the unity of creation could become the unwitting armorer of theories that divided humankind into castes and orders. The specific case of Lemuria traveled along with these currents. Haeckel's confident placement of a human cradle upon a southern platform nourished speculations in several languages. German readers found in it a pleasing symmetry, since German science had carried the banner of evolution on the continent. French readers, through translations and review essays, wove the idea into the growing colonial interest in Madagascar and the Mascarenes. British readers took a certain pride from the fact that the word Lemuria had been coined in their journals and had now been given such cosmopolitan duty. Even in the United States, one can find magazines of the period reposting maps and diagrams with an almost novelistic pleasure. The name felt like a password at a club where the newest ideas were being passed from hand to hand. There was a visual dimension to this spread that cannot be overstated. Haeckel was a superb draftsman. His illustrations of radiolarians and jellyfish still look like the grammar of living forms written out in a beautifully ordered script. When he turned his hand to human origins, the drawing was more schematic, yet it retained a force that text alone could not equal. The plate that showed radiations of mankind, with a central region labeled as first home and arrows running outward toward continents, fixed itself in the eye. Those arrows were more than lines. They were promises that the tangle of languages and customs one encountered across the world could be reduced to a simple geometry. To a modern reader, that geometry can look like a net thrown over seas that were far less generous to migrants than Haeckel supposed. Yet, in the context of his time, the geometry had a logic. If one assumed a great southern land in ages past, the Indian Ocean was no longer all water. It was a field marked with paths that had once been dry. Long before oceanographers traced ridges and trenches with instruments, Men imagined the seafloor as a terrain of valleys and heights, akin to the land they knew. Haeckel's imagination walked those heights and set a first camp for the ancestors there. He was not alone in placing first homes in warm zones. 19th century thinkers often preferred tropical origins on principle. They imagined that early humans needed no clothing, that food could be taken from trees and riverbanks with little labor, that only later would colder climates demand the inventiveness that we now consider the hallmark of our species. The archaeology of the Stone Age was in its infancy, and the romance of an easy beginning had not yet met the hard facts of glacial cycles and the deep antiquity of northern settlements. In such a climate of thought, Lemuria's warmth was a virtue, not an obstacle. Other lines of research appeared to add slender supports to the picture. Linguists who were trying to classify the tongues of India and the islands to the east sometimes claimed to see affinities that suggested very old migrations. Folklore collectors in India and Ceylon recorded stories of lands swallowed by the sea, which were taken by some to be faint folk memories of a lost southern world. Botanists who compared the floras of southern continents noticed clusters of related species that would be explained more easily by contact than by rare transoceanic chance. None of these threads was strong by itself. Together they produced the feeling of a tapestry whose pattern could be seen even if some of the stitches were loose. Haeckel's own enthusiasm could make thin evidence feel firm. He was that kind of teacher. He would point to a diagram and speak of it as if it were a map drawn from a 1,000-year memory, rather than a few decades of argument and fieldwork. For students and readers who wanted clarity, this was a kindness. For opponents who preferred to leave a question open rather than force it to an answer, it could be infuriating. Yet Haeckel's force of personality helped ensure that Lemuria would not remain a local term buried in a zoological journal. He made it cosmopolitan. He made it part of the human story. There is a further strand to follow, and it leads in directions that Haeckel likely did not foresee. When he placed a human cradle upon a lost southern land, he built a platform that mystics and occultists would later occupy. The theosophists read him, or read those who had read him, and took the contours of his map as invitations. If there had been a first home on a continent now vanished, then that home could be peopled with whatever wisdom one wished to ascribe to it. Atlantis had ancient texts behind it. Lemuria had modern science behind it, however speculative. The difference mattered to readers who longed for a myth that could be told in the language of the present. In salons from Berlin to Bombay, one might hear Lemuria spoken of with a half smile, as if science had at last found the old Eden by another name. It is worth returning to the banks of the Solo River, where Dubois pried a skullcap from the earth and felt the rush that comes when a conjecture becomes a thing you can hold in your hands. He had gone to the Indies because a German professor told the world that Asia held secrets Africa could not. He had looked along brown river water and through tall grasses because his mind had been turned toward a southern and eastern frame. When he weighed the skull in his palm, he brought a report not only to the museum but to the map. The Javanese bones supported the idea of an Asian theater for early human drama. They did not settle the question. They were treated with suspicion by some for years, but they changed the weather of the conversation. Haeckel, for his part, did not live to see the more complete fossil record that would come to light in Africa and Asia in the 20th century. He did not see the Leakeys in Olduvai or the later work in Ethiopia and South Africa that would tip the balance back toward an African origin for the human line. He did not see the rise of plate tectonics and the way it would alter the very ground on which debates about lost continents were held. He saw only the first turns of the wheel. and he pushed with all his strength in the direction he believed was right. In doing so, he gave Lemuria a role in the human story that went far beyond the lemurs that had lent it its name. On certain evenings in Gina, students walked home with the winter air hard in their lungs and the professor's words still bright in their minds. They had heard of a motherland in the south, a vanished stage upon which the first actors spoke a language that had not yet learned the tricks of grammar. They had traced arrows on a page and felt the thrill that comes when a crowd of facts suddenly falls into alignment. Haeckel had given them that alignment. Whether the earth itself would grant it remained to be seen. In the meantime, it had the weight that conviction can bring to an age that loves diagrams, and the authority of a master who draws them with a sure hand. The parlor at Irving Place in New York had a fashionable restlessness that suited the city. Teacups rattled against their saucers when the trolley passed, and the talk moved between seances and Sanskrit as if they were natural companions. In the autumn of 1875, a Russian noblewoman with a fierce gaze and a laugh that could conquer a room began to gather the curious and the learned in one circle. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky did not carry herself like a visiting seer. She smoked. She argued. She loved a good footnote. Alongside her stood a former American officer named Henry Steele Olcott and a young Irish-American jurist named William Quan Judge. The three announced the foundation of a society devoted to the study of ancient wisdom and to the testing of hidden laws in nature. The Theosophical Society was born in a city that loved both newspapers and novelty. Blavatsky arrived with a personal legend already in place. She had traveled across the Near East and as far as India, and she claimed to have studied in Tibet with teachers she called the Mahatmas. She wrote with an assurance that made the unknown feel catalogued. Within 2 years, she published a great restless volume called Isis Unveiled. It was a symphony of citation that interrupted itself with stories and polemics. Her target was what she called materialism, the new faith in matter and mechanism that she believed had pushed spirit to the edge of public life. She told her readers that the old wisdom kept in the East and in secret brotherhoods had answers that modern science could not reach. It was not until 1888 that she offered her largest map of the human past. The Secret Doctrine is a work that refuses the easy summary. It is a book that piles stanza on stanza from a supposed primordial text called the Stanzas of Xian, and makes of them a history of worlds before ours, and of races older than any remembered by scripture. At the core of the scheme is a series of root races. They are not races in the narrow sense of color or nation, but stages in the development of human consciousness through cycles measured in ages. The first was ethereal and long vanished. The second bore the name Hyperborean in a way that borrowed a classical fragrance. The third was Lemurian. The fourth was Atlantean. And the fifth was the present humanity, which she called Aryan in the wide philological sense then common in European parlance. Blavatsky placed Lemuria as a continent that once stretched across what is now the Indian and Pacific Oceans. She wrote as if it were a country lost to time but not to competent memory. Her Lemurians were not mere islanders washed away by a careless sea. They were chapters in the making of mind. In early Lemurian time, she said, the beings had bodies not yet fixed in the dense forms familiar to us. They reproduced in ways that began without partners, then passed into a stage of egg-laying, and only late came to the division into sexes that we take as natural. She claimed that a single eye in the back of the head gave these beings a vision of surrounding fields that would later retreat into the pineal gland as a vestige of a power humanity no longer used. Giants walked those coasts and inland plateaus. They lived under a sky that had not yet settled into the rhythms we know. Dinosaurs were present in that far age, an echo of the recent discoveries in bone quarries that had fired the public mind with visions of immense reptiles. Lemuria, in her telling, perished in fire. Volcanoes shook with long convulsions. The sea came in. Islands remained as a necklace of reminders. Readers who had followed Haeckel could hear the scientific cadence in her emphasis on stages and development. She admired his audacity while rejecting what she called the poverty of a vision that allowed only matter and chance, a voice in the making of things. She quoted him. She chided him. She pressed his speculation into service and then rehabilitated it under a more spacious law. The same is true of Sclater. She knew the paper on the mammals of Madagascar and the tidy coinage of the word Lemuria. She took that coin and set it in a crown. Theosophy had a genius for gathering scattered curiosities and arranging them as if they had been meant to sit beside one another. New York made a fine first stage, but it could not hold Blavatsky for long. In 1879, she and Olcott sailed east and made their way to India, and then to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where they took public part in a new Buddhist revival. She wrote dispatches that glowed with the light of temples and with the anger that comes when a missionary brushes aside what he does not understand. By 1882, the society had a headquarters on a tree-covered estate at Adyar near Madras. There the air was heavy with river heat, and the rooms filled with young Indians, British officials, Brahmins, Anglo-Indians, and the curious of every sort who wished to be present at the making of an idea. Journals rolled off the press. Among them was a periodical with the provocative title Lucifer, which carried essays that mingled Plato and physics in ways that made critics grind their teeth and made readers feel that a forgotten academy had returned to life. The cosmology described at Adyar had a scale that astonished even seasoned students of myth. It spoke of rounds within rounds. Worlds are born and die, and are born again. Species have their time and then retire to make room for others. The Lemurian epoch was one such time, and the continent was one such world stage. The details could be disarming in their specificity. In one set of teachings, the Lemurian homeland ran north to south, through lands where the Mascarene Plateau rises now as shoals and island groups, and eastward toward what would be called Oceania in later atlases. Survivals were claimed in the highlands of Australia. In another text, the ruins of the Lemurian culture were said to whisper from lonely islands where statues with long faces looked to the sea. The advantage of an oceanic setting is that it is generous with evidence if one knows how to imagine. By the 1890s, a younger generation of theosophists began to add finishing touches to what had started as a skeleton of chapters. William Scott Elliott, a businessman by training and a mystic by habit, published two slim but potent books, The Story of Atlantis and The Lost Lemuria. He said that he relied upon clairvoyant explorers who traveled in a manner of controlled vision through the past, as easily as a surveyor walks a field. He described Lemurians as tall, brown-skinned, heavy-boned beings with broad faces and strong jaws. He said they had a curious gait and a habit of looking far into the distance with an acuity that modern men had lost. He spoke of cities built of massive stones. He spoke of a great cataclysm when mountain chains lifted and fire rained from the sky. The tone of these books was unlike Blavatsky's dense tapestry. It was the tone of a guidebook. The dates were given in long numbers. The maps had borders. The details queasily resembled the scientific literature of the day in their presentation, while departing from it entirely in their source of authority. Two leaders of the Adyar Circle, Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbeater, blessed this method. Besant had a commanding presence and a voice trained in the working world of English reform politics. Leadbeater had the smoothness of a schoolmaster who knows that certainty is a balm. Together they made theosophy more institutional and more practical. They adopted Scott Eliot's narratives as convenient charts in their own philosophy of the growth of soul through cycles of rebirth and through classrooms beyond the physical world. In their rendering, Lemuria was not merely a lost land, but a necessary school where certain faculties were learned and later set aside. The human story was a syllabus. The continents were the classrooms. The larger Victorian world did not watch this unfolding in silence. The Society for Psychical Research in London sent an investigator named Richard Hodgson to examine claims that Blavatsky received letters from the Mahatmas in ways that defied ordinary transmission. He lived for months within the Theosophical Circle at Adyar and took statements from staff and visitors. In 1885, he published a report that accused Blavatsky of fraud and suggested that at least some of the miracles were products of human contrivance. The report was greeted as a victory by those who wished the movement to be a mere fashion. It was denounced as a libel by those who saw in it a misunderstanding of teachings purposely given in parable and disguise. The quarrel did not sink theosophy. It taught its members that doubt is a chronic condition in a world that insists on laboratory proofs of what it does not wish to see. In India, the story took on colors that were not available in New York or London. Sanskrit scholars who had been trained in the cool rooms of the new Oriental institutes were drawn to a society that treated their texts as living scripture. Young nationalists heard in theosophy a respect for their heritage that contrasted with the contempt that leaked from some colonial offices. Tamil readers in particular found themselves attentive to the passages that placed Lemuria south of India. There were old poems that spoke of lands called Kumari that had vanished under the sea. The fit between Sanskritic learning, Tamil legends, and the new cosmology created a lively correspondence. Theosophical journals ran articles on pre-Vedic ages and on Dravidian antiquity in a manner that blurred scholarship and vision, but rewarded readers with a sense that their own antiquities belonged to a world story rather than to footnotes in European monographs. A different public encountered Lemuria in the salons and backrooms of Europe and America, where spiritualism had made table rapping and trance speaking familiar amusements and sometimes sincere quests. The theosophical Lemuria gave these circles a frame in which to place messages that claimed to come from ancient beings. Mediums used the name as if it were a country on a recently discovered map. Novelists borrowed it. One can find adventure tales in which secret survivors of Lemuria live under Australian deserts or upon forgotten islands. The velvet chairs of London clubs and the verandas of Bombay bungalows became stages for quiet arguments about whether the statues of Easter Island faced the sea because they waited for redeemed sailors of a drowned race to return. The most striking feature of this period is the way that theosophy adopted the public language of science while refusing its boundaries. Its journals resembled review magazines. Its lectures were supported by diagrams that looked as if they had been lifted from geological treatises and then retitled. Its leaders were comfortable citing Huxley by the paragraph in order to step over him into speculation. They quoted Darwin and then declared that the law of evolution was real, but that its realm was larger than biology and included the growth of spirit through bodies and beyond them. Theosophy was an education in the art of walking along the border between laboratory and temple. That border makes scholars nervous. It makes readers alert. It is not possible to understand the hold that Lemuria gained over the imagination without sitting for a time in the reading room at Adyar, where drawers of correspondences rested near the windows and the views of palms and river light entered the eye. Visitors wrote of the sense that history had been stretched. A fossil in a museum case seemed poorer after such afternoons. The world became a palimpsest where texts had been written and scraped away and written again, and where what a scientist called the Miocene might be read alongside a stanza that told of a race that spoke to the stars with voices we no longer possess. It is a sensation that respectable history tends to suppress. The Theosophists encouraged it and disciplined it with a syllabus. Across the wider world, the same currents were at work in less learned ways. On the slopes of Mount Shasta in California, a young writer named Frederick Spencer Oliver published A Dweller on Two Planets in 1894 and told of an underground city called Telos, where Lemurian survivors preserved an art of living that mixed crystal engines and quiet contemplation. The book had the fragrance of pulp romance and the cadence of a personal revelation. It echoed the language that had risen at Adyar and made of it a local legend. That echo would sound for a century among seekers who walked the pine forests there at night and spoke softly of robed figures who passed between trees as silently as fog. By the turn of the century, Lemuria had left the zoological paper where it was born and had taken up residence in a library that stretched from parlour to monastery. The old Victorian world had grown fond of a certain arrangement of thought. It liked to see exploration, science, empire, and literature pass drinks to one another at the same table. The Theosophists were done with that arrangement. They set their own table and invited everyone at once. The geologist who could forgive a metaphor was welcome. The Sanskritist who was tired of footnotes was welcome. The student who had felt the ache that comes from looking too long at bones under glass was welcome. On the wall was a map of a continent that did not appear on Admiralty charts. On the table was a book with a title page that said it had been written before mankind learned to write. As evening came on at Adyar, the lamps drew moths, and the river quieted to a slow reflection. The city beyond the trees stirred and slept by turns. In the library, Annie Besant stood beside a globe and traced for a cluster of students a long arc from the Mascarene banks to the islands of the Pacific. She spoke in a clear English and paused now and then to let a question rise from the floor. The questions were not of the sort that can be settled in a laboratory. They were of the sort that travel by rumor through generations. Where did we begin? What did we know before we forgot? The room felt very old, as if it had borrowed an hour from another age. A generation after Helena Blavatsky drew Lemuria into the warm light of the parlor, the legend moved out onto bookstalls and into the hands of men who preferred certainties, dressed as discovery. The scene shifts now to Yucatan and to the Pacific, to museum lecture rooms and small publishers who understood that a clean map with a bold caption can do the work of a dozen footnotes. The 19th century had ended in a fever for origins. The 20th opened with a hunger for master narratives that would bind the scattered ruins of the world into a single story. In that hunger, the name Mu took root. It sounded like a prayer and a password, and it promised to be the mother country beneath every myth. Augustus Le Plongeon set the tone. A French photographer and antiquarian, he and his wife Alice spent the 1870s among the Maya sites of Yucatan, living beside the broken palaces of Uxmal and Chichen Itza, and bringing back glass plates of the highest quality then possible in the field. Le Plongeon was no mere tourist. He measured and traced and tried to read. He convinced himself that he had cracked the secrets of the so-called Troano manuscript, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian books. His translations, confident and quite wrong, told of a great land called Mu that had sunk in a cataclysm, and of a queen he called Mu who fled to Egypt and became the inspiration for the Sphinx. The argument appeared in a book with a title that declared more than it proved. Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx was part romance, part polemic, and all certitude. Specialists shook their heads. The public leaned forward. Here was a claim that turned the ancient world on its head. Egypt, the teacher of nations in the European imagination, had borrowed from America. Between them had stretched the vanished ground of Mu, an ancestral hearth now lost under the sea. Le Plonge was already folding the many meanings of Lemuria into a new single syllable. He spoke with authority, not only about Yucatan, but about the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. He believed that remnants of Mu lay concealed in the customs of Pacific Islanders, that the colossal works on Easter Island, which few Europeans had seen at close range, were a message from that drowned past. His vision had a romance that made the map glow. An earlier world had known a unity that modern nations could only dream of. He did not hesitate to place this unity at the root of all the older civilizations that Europe admired. A motherland had sent out its children to build in stone across two oceans. James Churchward took this romance and made of it a publishing empire. He was born in England, spent years in colonial service in India, emigrated to New York, and cultivated the air of a capable man who had wandered far and learned things not taught in schools. In the 1920s and 30s, he published a sequence of books that gave Mu its fullest life. The Lost Continent of Mu in 1926 announced the thesis with the energy of a showman. The children of Mu, the sacred symbols of Mu, and cosmic forces of Mu followed. Churchward said that as a young man he had studied with a high priest in India who had shown him secret Narkal tablets written in a script older than known scripts and preserved in a monastery that kept watch over a wisdom older than Babylon. From these and from research in museums and libraries, he claimed he had reconstructed a world that was long forgotten by the scholars, but remembered in stone and myth. Churchward drew maps in a firm hand. His Mu spread across the Pacific, like a continent apart. It touched the Philippines and stretched toward Japan, ran south toward Easter Island, and swung back toward the coast of South America. He dated its destruction to a time before known civilizations, but not so far back as to make it unreachable to human memory. He assigned population totals in the tens of millions and listed colonies where his Mu had planted outposts and arts. He said that Egypt, Sumer, the Indus cities, and Mesoamerica were branches from this original trunk. He wrote of a sacred flower symbol that traveled with them, and of a set of cosmic forces known in Mu that work through waves and magnetic lines, which later peoples only dimly recalled. If one looks past the grand claims, one can see how Churchward built his case out of shrewd borrowings. The idea that motifs repeat across far continents is an old truth in art history. The lotus and the serpent and the sun disk can be found in many places because they are powerful images, not because they guarantee a single source. The fact that Pacific voyagers crossed immense spaces by reading wind and wave is one of the marvels of human history. Churchward took that accomplishment and raised it into a system for continents where islands stood. He had an instinct for attaching his story to places that already held a mystery for the public. Easter Island became a standing proof in his pages, even though he had no new evidence to present about its statues. He described the megalithic city of Nan Madol in Micronesia with a gaze that turned it into a page from his tablets, even though its builders belonged to a culture with its own known history in the Caroline Islands. He read fractal patterns into Polynesian tattoo as if they were freighted with messages from the motherland. At times, he leaned on living men whose names had a museum weight. He cited the English geologist John Milne on earthquakes and island formation. He quoted from translations of Indian Vedic hymns and from the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiche Maya. He wrote about the Naga and the Nagwal with equal ease, creating a wide shelf of resemblances that felt convincing when placed side by side. Where specialists saw one more survey of other men's work, the general reader saw the bright thread of a single pattern. In Mexico, his story found an unexpected ally in stone. William Niven, a stubborn and energetic fieldman who had scoured the Valley of Mexico for artifacts, uncovered in the 1910s and 20s a large number of carved and incised stones at a site near San Miguel Amantla. They were covered with signs no scholar could read. Niven thought them proof of a culture older than the Aztec, and older perhaps than the Olmec. Churchward seized on the find and proclaimed that the signs matched the writing of the Narkle tablets, which only he had seen and which no one else could examine. The circle was complete. Evidence led to Mu, because Mu had been used to explain the evidence. The stones themselves have since become a footnote in the long history of hopeful claims in the Mexican highlands. At the time, they gave Churchward perfect illustrations for his books and perfect captions to place beneath his maps. The way Churchward wrote mattered as much as what he claimed. He described meetings with learned priests in shadowed rooms, but he did so in the tone of a competent engineer who has mastered the principles of a steam engine. He used equations when he wrote of cosmic forces. He appealed to common sense. He preferred the declarative sentence. He gave Mu the voice of a workshop foreman rather than the voice of a prophet. In this, he was very modern. He promised readers that they could own a secret by mastering a diagram. The effect on popular culture was immediate. Newspaper features took up Mu as if it were a fact. Pulp magazines ran stories in which heroes found ruins on lost islands and escaped with a jewel that contained a message. Occult circles that had already embraced Lemuria now had a fresh set of names and places. Adventure writers slipped Mu into their plot lines. In the wider literature of the strange, the name appeared beside Atlantis and beside names pulled from lost Greek fragments and Sanskrit lexicons. If Atlantis held the Atlantic for imagination, Mu held the Pacific. There were skeptics who spoke up at once. Professional archaeologists in Mexico and in the United States had no patience for readings of the Maya books that ignored the work of trained epigraphers. Geologists in Britain and in America were already uneasy with any claim that placed a continent across an ocean basin in recent ages. They could not yet describe the physics of drifting continents, but they were learning to read the age of oceanic basalts and the story told by chains of volcanoes. They knew that the present shape of the Pacific was very old at human scales. Churchward brushed such cautions aside with the assurance that a man develops when his readers are loyal and his critics cannot agree among themselves. The new century also had another way of keeping a story alive. Novelists and authors of occult encyclopedias gave Mu a home in a growing shared world of myth. One can open a small press volume from the 1920s or 30s and find Mu treated as a chapter in a compendium of ancient wisdom that includes Shambhala, Hyperborea, the Tuatha De Danann, and a half-dozen places drawn from the margins of classical texts. The facts are not interrogated in such books, they are arranged. The arrangement flatters the desire for a world that was once whole. It also feeds the hunger that modernity itself had sharpened, a hunger for continuity in a century of fast machines and faster wars. Churchward's books kept selling. His lectures drew curious crowds. He made more maps. He redrew some when he changed his mind. He gave Mu its own script and its own priestly castes. He claimed that its people had mastered an early form of electricity that was not bound by wires and circuits, and that drew its strength from forces in the air and in the sea. He said that these powers had been used across temples, and that their echo could be felt in the tales that speak of stones that move and sing. Here we touch the edge of what later generations would call ancient astronaut theory. If temples hummed with power and if stones moved in a manner that defied ordinary muscle, then perhaps the knowledge was not only early but otherworldly. Churchward did not say this outright. Others would. They would take his stage set and put different actors on it. They would stand on a lava field in Polynesia with a camera crew and ask whether the builders had received help from beyond the earth. They would point to his maps and call them flight paths. The legend that began in a zoological paper and was transformed in a theosophical library had now acquired a runway. The honest student of this period must say that the line between research and romance was not policed with much care. That is not to say that everyone was a charlatan. It is to say that the desire for meaning was so strong that men and women accepted leaps that they would not have accepted in a tax case or a medical diagnosis. The very word continent carries a weight in the mind. It suggests a platform underfoot. It turns the chaos of islands and currents into a single body. If one adds to that word the promise of a maternal role in the story of civilization, one has a spell that can withstand a great many objections. Into this atmosphere strode explorers whose exploits were otherwise entirely real. Thor Heyerdahl would not cross the Pacific on the Kon-Tiki until the 1940s. Yet even earlier, there were travelers who argued that the skills of ancient sailors had been underestimated. They were right about that. Polynesian navigation is one of the pure triumphs of human culture. Their insistence on a capacity for long-distance contact found an eager audience that had been coached by Churchward and by Le Plongeon to see every echo as a message. When professional scholars of the Pacific built the real history of migrations in Oceania with linguistics, archaeology, and oral tradition, they did so in part against the foil of Mu. They cleared the legend away in order to see the actual voyages more clearly. In the end, the most powerful thing about Mu in these years was not any single claim but the mood it created. It invited readers to stand on a shoreline at dusk and look out across water and believe that the horizon had once been a road. It invited them to see a shared ancestry in the stones and symbols that the world keeps repeating for reasons that are sometimes profound and sometimes merely human. It let nationalists imagine a primacy that no conqueror could undo, and it let mystics align their meditations with a geography too vast to patrol. It insisted that the center of the world lay somewhere out at sea, that the ancient heart beat below the waves, that the lost could be recovered by those who had the right kind of patience. In a small office off Fifth Avenue in New York, the publisher who handled Churchward's volumes liked to show visitors a map of the Pacific that had been hand-tinted by an artist in the shop. The blues were deep and layered, and the island chains appeared like punctuation in a long sentence that trailed away into open water. He would place a paperweight on the corner and smooth the sheet and speak of the orders he was shipping to San Francisco and Sydney and Honolulu. He knew he was in the business of wonder. He also knew that the business had rules. Give the reader a cause. Give the reader a line that joins many points. Give the reader a name they can say softly to themselves when the house is quiet. There is a certain heat in the air at Adyar when the monsoon bides its time. The river slows, the palms still, and the rooms hold conversations like lanterns hold light. In the early years of the 20th century, that compound on the edge of Madras was a crossroads. Scholars of Sanskrit and Pali stopped by to argue a point of grammar. British officials listened for the undertone of politics in every spiritual lecture. Young Indians leafed through journals that bound Upanishads to physics and legends to cartography. On the map that hung near the secretary's desk, a pale continental shape floated across the Indian and Pacific Oceans with a name in neat ink: Lemuria. What began in a zoological paper and then passed through theosophy had now begun to seed itself in the imaginations of people who were less interested in root races than in roots of a different kind. If there had been a lost southern land, who had lived there first? Whose story did it confirm? To understand why Lemuria found such fertile ground in South India, it helps to begin with a language lesson. In 1856, a missionary scholar named Robert Caldwell published a work with a dry title and a quiet power: A Comparative Grammar of the Dravidian or South Indian Family of Languages. The book set in scholarly cement what many had sensed. Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam formed a family of their own with deep antiquity. They were not offshoots of Sanskrit, though they had borrowed much from it. Caldwell wrote with respect for the age and beauty of Tamil and for the kinship among the southern tongues. His arguments entered schools and government offices. They also entered a young politics that was beginning to define itself against the scholarly habit of treating everything ancient in India as a northern possession. Once the idea of a distinct Dravidian antiquity gained elegance and force, the question of origins followed. Where had the first speakers lived? When had they flourished? Part of the answer lay in the classical Tamil corpus that Indian scholars were then rescuing from old palm leaf manuscripts. U.V. Swaminatha Iyer has the air of a detective in his photographs. He is thin and intent, and the papers in his hands look like evidence. He traveled widely to find old texts, transcribed them, and published them with a care that allowed a public to meet its own past with fresh eyes. Through his work and the labor of others, the great poems and epics of classical Tamil returned to common view. These texts spoke of cities and courts, of learned assemblies that critics and poets called Sangam. They also carried a recurring image that struck readers with an almost physical force. The sea takes land. Coasts are not eternal lines. In the Silapadikaram, there is a tidal violence that ruins a city and a royal house. In later medieval works, the Pandya kings extend their realm over a region called Kumari and then lose ground to the encroaching sea. By the late 19th century, these literary memories began to bind themselves to a scientific-sounding name from London journals. Lemuria seemed to offer a stage on which those old poems could stand with dignity before the judgment of modernity. Tamil writers and orators did not need a European to grant them antiquity. But, in an age when a laboratory tone could silence a room, the word Lemuria served a purpose. It allowed them to point at a map and say that a scholar's name now sat over a land their own poets had known by another name. Kumari Kandam. The feeling of recognition can sustain an argument for a very long time. The most forceful voices in this turn were not professors. They were public intellectuals with the ardor of revivalists. Maraimalai Adigal spoke for a pure Tamil free of Sanskrit impurities and for a moral vision built on that purity. Devanaya Pavanar wrote of a Tamil that he believed to be the most ancient mother tongue, with roots older than Sanskrit and perhaps older than any other. He placed those roots firmly in a southern land that the sea had taken. To support these claims, he drew on classical poems and medieval commentaries, on folklore from the fishing villages along the coast near Kanyakumari, where the waters of two seas meet, and on the fabled three Sangams that tradition claimed had met on land, now lost. Theosophical journals helped by offering a cosmology in which long cycles of destruction and renewal were a law of nature rather than a poetic device. Science, scripture, and local memory became allies. Schools took notice. In the early decades of the 20th century, one could find Tamil primers that spoke easily of Kumari Kandam, and in the decades after independence, the story did not vanish. In 1981, the government of Tamil Nadu funded a documentary that sought to align the legend with new research, a sign that the lost land had taken on the dignity of heritage. Maps were drawn that showed a shelf of country running south from the tip of India, dotted with names that recalled ancient kings. The intent was not mischief, it was pride. If a people had been told for generations that its language was merely derivative and its history merely regional, the insistence on a drowned motherland felt like an act of recovery. Scholars in Chennai and elsewhere pushed against the more extravagant claims while often granting the deeper point. Yes, they said, Tamil is very old and deserving of serious study on its own terms. Yes, the classical literature has a breadth and elegance that stands beside the most refined works of the ancient world. No, the entire Southern Ocean was not home to a lost metropolitan civilization whose records were washed away whole. In the same decades, geologists were recovering a story of the Indian Ocean that allowed a new kind of confirmation allied to caution. The Mascarene Plateau and the microcontinent of Mauritius show that in very deep time there had been blocks of continental crust scattered under those waters. The age of those rocks was deep beyond human memory. They did not confirm a recent paradise. Yet the very language of submerged continents and torn plates entered Tamil discussions, the way a new word enters a conversation and gives permission to say something that had long been felt. Science disallowed a fairy tale. It also refused to shut the door on loss as a human experience. The power of the Lemuria story in South India rested on a final logic that was more moral than empirical. If a culture has been taught to take its bearings from a center somewhere else, then placing the center in one's own sea feels like a correction. The scholar Sumathi Ramaswamy would later write about this sensibility with a lucid sympathy, tracing its roots through schoolrooms, newspapers, and political speeches. Her work is worth mentioning not to settle the story, but to mark its dignity. What looks from a distance like a zealous myth can, on closer inspection, appear as a poetic and political language that insisted on respect. Across the ocean in Australia, Lemuria served a different household of needs. Theosophists had planted a flag there early. The Society's branches in Sydney and Melbourne drew crowds for lectures in which maps were unrolled and continents placed where the charts of hydrographers did not permit them. Helena Blavatsky had written that parts of Australia were remnants of ancient Lemuria and that the Aboriginal peoples belonged to a very old human stock, which she catalogued within her scheme of root races. Her theory bore the assumptions and prejudices of her time, and in the hands of writers who lacked even her respect, it could slide into a coarse taxonomy that justified exclusion. Settler society in Australia was inventing itself with a quickness that often left people breathless. Some sought an antiquity that would precede the awkward facts of recent conquest. A lost race myth could do that work, and Lemuria was ready to hire out. In 1898, George Firth Scott published a novel with a crisp title, The Last Lemurian. It follows a young explorer who discovers a hidden valley in the interior, where a remnant of ancient Lemurians survive with treasures in their keeping and a terrible curse contained in a cave. The details are the familiar furniture of a popular genre. There is a priestess, there are jewels, and there are monsters to test the hero's mettle. Yet the setting is the important fact. The Australian outback becomes an archive in stone. The outcrop, the desert basin, the lonely range of hills are not simply features of a dry land. They are the vault of a lost world. The book sold, and it took its place alongside other romances by Rider Haggard and his many imitators who set entire chapters of their tales in empires that archaeologists had not found. A more insistent version of the same impulse surfaced in a body of scientific and pseudo-scientific writing, which tried to fix Australia within a deep racial timeline. It is not fair to lay this at the door of science alone. The ambient culture already divided the world into orders of advancement and decay. In such a climate, it was easy for a reader to accept assertions that Aboriginal Australians had preserved traces of a very early human condition because they were the descendants of Lemurians. Some theosophical pamphlets wrote this with a tone of condescension wrapped in wonder. Some newspapers did so with a tone of bureaucratic efficiency that makes the modern reader wince. The result was the same: an imagined continent that rose from the sea across a map, allowed people to sort their neighbors into a hierarchy without having to examine their own history closely. As in South India, there were countervailing winds. Anthropologists in Australia and New Zealand were building a careful record of kinship systems, languages, rock art, and ritual life that refused the cyclone of myth. They insisted on the depth and complexity of the cultural worlds before colonization. They insisted that deserts were not voids waiting for explorers to find hidden temples. They were homelands with songs for every path. Colonial legislators did not always listen, but a different kind of map began to appear in the notes and monographs of field workers. It had the look of a palimpsest. A modern town was laid over an older system of places and paths. An old law still breathed under a new fence. Elsewhere, the Lemuria story slipped into national projects with surprising ease. In Turkey during the 1930s, the young republic sought a past that would be worthy of its ambitions. The Turkish history thesis and the Sun language theory tried to place the Turkish people at or near the center of human beginnings. Within that atmosphere, an envoy named Tarzin Mayatepec wrote reports from Mexico in which he drew bold connections between Mayan language and Turkic words. He did not stop there. He drew from Churchward's popular books on Mu and asserted that the peoples of the Americas and the Turks shared a common origin in a vanished Pacific world. These ideas received a respectful hearing at the very top because the new nation was actively testing ways to anchor identity in deep time. Churchward's paper Continent thus made a brief appearance in the anteroom of state ideology. The episode did not last, but it shows how nimble the Lemuria myth had become. It could serve Tamil nationalism, colonial romance, and republican pride without changing much of its surface. In Madagascar and the French colonial world, another sort of entanglement appeared. French naturalists and administrators produced monumental catalogues of the island's fauna and flora. Alfred Grandidier's name stands highest among them. The scale of the project was heroic and admirable. It also fed a certain way of thinking. If an island displayed the traces of very old separations, the naturalist could tell a story of isolation that seemed to call for a steward. The official could then imagine himself as that steward. Lemuria here offered not a lost homeland, but a rationalization. The island was a museum case. The label under the glass required a curator. The curator could be French. One can find in colonial writing of the early 20th century the lightest touch of this conceit, sometimes innocent and sometimes proud. Scholars of media and religion note that myths survive because they are portables. They are light enough to carry and heavy enough to feel important. Lemuria was a model. It had a shape and a color and a set of dates that allowed it to be copied into any atlas of the mind. A Tamil schoolchild could see it to the south and call it Kumari. A Melbourne lecturer could tilt the map and draw a line from Perth to Easter Island and call it the spine of a vanished land. A Turkish diplomat could open a churchward volume and imagine the Pacific as a bridge between his nation and a distant shore. Each person felt the confidence that comes from saying the word continent in a firm voice. As the century advanced, science began to cancel the checks that myth had written. Plate tectonics taught a different story about oceans and their age. Oceanographers mapped the floors with instruments rather than guesses, and found mountains and basins that had their own laws. Yet, even as the literal possibility of a recent sunken motherland faded, the emotional work that Lemuria had been doing did not stop. It migrated into new forms. New Age writers rebaptized old mountains with Lemurian names. Pulp adventures gave way to films that placed ancient secrets under the Pacific. Television crews filmed at Nan Madol and asked the same questions that Churchward had taught his readers to ask. The map remained faithful to desire. At Kanyakumari, where the seas meet and the air smells of salt and jasmine, there is a stone platform where visitors stand and look south. On certain evenings, the fishermen bring their boats in with slow strokes, and the cloud line sits low upon the horizon. Older men tell the children that in the time of their grandparents, the tide was not the same. In the time of the grandparents of their grandparents, it was lower still. They do not need a lecture on isostasy or a treatise on submerged banks. They need only the sight of waves breaking on rocks that appear or vanish with the season, and a poem that tells of a city taken by water. Behind them are bus idols. In its window, a school project is taped, a careful pencil drawing of a map, with a pale country drawn in the sea, and a name written in block letters across it. The child who made it has copied the outline of India with accuracy, and has placed a small compass rose in the corner. She has drawn a line of tiny temples on the lost land, and a line of tiny trees along its coast. That is how stories remain. They borrow a ruler and a pencil and climb aboard for the ride home. The ship that went looking for truth carried hemp lines and brass thermometers, canvas sails, and a coal-fired engine, and a set of questions that no library in London could answer. When the Challenger left Portsmouth in the winter of 1872, she began the first sustained attempt to take the measure of the world ocean. The crew paid out sounding lines measured in fathoms and hauled up ooze that looked like wet chalk. They lowered dredges and raised manganese nodules that felt like black knuckles in a sailor's palm. In the Indian Ocean, they found banks and ridges, long scars and sudden climbs, signs that the seafloor was a landscape with a history. Those who watched the returns began to understand that the bottom of the sea was not a graveyard of silt. It was a country. In that country, the old Victorian habit of explaining puzzles with sunken land became less a certainty and more a suspicion that would require proof of a kind the century did not yet possess. The idea of Lemuria had been sensible in its youth. If animals of a single clan lived both in Madagascar and in India, and if the mainland of Africa did not tell the same story, why not imagine a vanished trail of land that would explain the kinship? A land bridge was a tool of thought. It did tidy work. The trouble was that as the tools of ocean science improved, the sea answered with facts that made tidy stories look like guesses. In the years after the Challenger voyage, a quiet revolution began in the study of Earth's deep history. Geologists catalogued mountain belts and read their stories in the tilt of strata and the chemistry of granite and basalt. Paleontologists filled drawers with fossils that connected one age to another with a clarity that would have startled a reader of earlier times. The idea that continents might drift entered the conversation as a dangerous suggestion. A young German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener gathered winds and stones into a single thought. He saw that the coasts of Africa and South America fit like old lumber that had once been joined. He noticed that identical fossils rested in distant beds, now separated by an ocean that simple animals could not cross. He collected evidence from glacial scratches and tropical coal seams that told of lands that had wandered from one climate to another. In 1912, he dared a book and a set of lectures that argued for continental drift. Wegener did not know the engine. He could not say what moved the continents. He could only draw the case that they had moved. The reception was chilly in places where old habits held. Geologists, who had grown up with steady continents and sinking land bridges, did not surrender easily. Yet the century that followed Wegener's first publishing would give him his engine and transform his conjecture into a geometry of the planet. It would also take Lemuria by the hand and lead it to the door. The first real map of the unknown country under the sea was drawn by someone who never sailed with a research vessel. Marie Tharp worked in a narrow office at Columbia, surrounded by stacks of soundings taken by ships that had crisscrossed the oceans during and after the war. She converted raw numbers into a living terrain. Pencil strokes shaped mountain chains and trenches, plains and rifts. In the Atlantic, she saw a valley that ran like a stitched wound down the middle of the ocean. When she and her colleague Bruce Heason brought the map to senior men, they were told that valleys of that sort were for the land, not the sea. Tharp held her ground. She laid earthquake epicenters along her valley like a string of beads, and the beads fell into place. The seafloor had a central rift. New crust was being made there and pushed aside to either side, as if on a conveyor. The principle that would organize the planet had come into focus. Seafloor spreading was not a metaphor, it was a process. In the Indian Ocean, that process was written in a different script, but it told the same tale. A long ridge ran from the Arabian Sea southward and then curved east, a mountain range underwater that would be given the name Carlsberg in its northern stretch and Central Indian in its southern. Earthquakes lined it as faithfully as stars line a constellation. The ridge was not a line of collapse. It was a factory. The signs of youth were everywhere once the right eyes looked. The basalt that made the ocean floor returned ages that were shockingly young compared to the rocks under the continents. The oldest ocean crust was not even a tenth the age of ancient continental shields. The continents rode like rafts of light material, old and buoyant, while the ocean basins were a restless skin that was made and consumed. An entire way of thinking sagged and gave way under the weight of this new arithmetic. If ocean crust is blue flame new on the scale of geologic time, then a recent continent that had sunk wholesale into the Indian Ocean, with traces of cities intact, could not be fitted into the record. The factory at the ridge and the furnace at the trenches left no room. The scientists who looked most closely at the young crust found a pattern written in iron. As lava cooled along the ridge, magnetic minerals lined up with the direction of the planet's field. That field had reversed many times in the past, and the frozen lavas kept a quiet memory of those reversals. Ships towed magnetometers and found zebra-like stripes of alternating polarity that ran parallel to the ridges and matched a global record already worked out by paleomagnetists on land. The stripes on either side of the ridge were mirror images. The seafloor had recorded its own birth certificate. In the Indian Ocean, the magnetic stripes lay like ripples in wind-blown sand. To imagine a continent called Lemuria sitting upon those ripples in any recent epoch required a kind of forgetting that the evidence refused to grant. In the late 1960s, a drilling ship with the romantic name Glomar Challenger lowered cores through miles of water and bit into the crust below. The deep-sea drilling project brought up columns of mud and rock that were dated with a precision and range that the 19th century could not have imagined. In every ocean, the cores told the same story. Sediments were thin near the ridge and thickened with distance. The age of the basalt rose with distance from the ridge like the age rings of a tree. In the Indian Ocean, the oldest crust sampled formed in the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. That is young in the language of continents. Nowhere did the drills tap an old continental basement except along margins and on a few high plateaus that had separate histories. A continent, as imagined by Sclater or by the Theosophists, could not be hidden in those numbers. The page of the Indian Ocean did contain palimpsests that gave the dreamers a brief second wind. The Seychelles Islands puzzled geologists at first. Their granite was continental rather than oceanic. The islands were a little library of rocks that did not belong to the new seafloor. The solution that took shape was more interesting than fiction. The Seychelles had once been part of the Indian plate when the great southern supercontinent we call Gondwana began to break apart. As India tore itself free and raced north toward Asia, the Seychelles were left behind like splinters. Further south and east, another large remnant would take a place in the story. In the second decade of the 21st century, geologists traced zircons in lavas on Mauritius that were far older than the island lavas themselves. The best explanation was a raided foundation. Beneath the youthful volcanic rock lay scraps of continental crust, a microcontinent that some named Mauritius. Other fragments were suspected along ridges that trailed from the Maldives and Laccadives to distant Chagos. These were not classrooms for a late human civilization. They were the broken bones of Gondwana. The irony was sweet. The core intuition that India and Madagascar had once been connected was correct, but the timescale was so deep that it emptied the legend of human presence. The consequence for Lemuria was decisive. In the 19th century, a person could imagine a land bridge that sagged beneath the sea and left no ruin but a shelf and a few shoals. In the 20th, and certainly in the 21st, a person who thought through the physics could not. Continental crust and oceanic crust differ in buoyancy and behavior. The continents are thick rafts. They do not sink whole into the mantle like stones. They can be broken, stretched, and thinned. Pieces can be left behind as splinters. They can be drowned under a shallow sea. But the vision of a wide, recent southern continent that carried cities and temples and then abruptly went under in the age of man does not fit the mechanics. The ocean basins themselves are the moving parts that receive new crust and recycle the old. A continent vanishing into a deep and young basin in human times is a poem, not a geological event. Other lines of evidence joined the case, like witnesses called to the stand. The history of the lemurs in Madagascar, the very animals that had given Lemuria its name, began to look different as biologists refined their tools. Genetic work and the fossil record suggested that the ancestors of lemurs reached Madagascar after it had already parted from Africa and India. The likely path was not across a continental bridge, but across the Mozambique Channel on rafts of storm-torn vegetation, helped by currents and chance and the iron law that small mammals can sometimes survive passages that sink larger ones. The ancestors arrived and found a world with few competitors and predators. They radiated into the astonishing array that fills the island's forests and haunts its night. That story had beauty and risk and time. It did not need a lost continent. Oceanographers in the second half of the 20th century found other details that made the Indian Ocean inhospitable to the preferred myths. The Kerguelen Plateau, a vast volcanic construction in the southern Indian Ocean, emerged as an ancient igneous province that had been above sea level only for a short time in the deep past. The 9 East Ridge told of a plate passing over a hotspot leaving a chain of volcanoes that aged like the beads of a rosary as one moved north. The Laccadive, Maldives, and Chagos ridges told a similar story, a track of a moving plate over a mantle plume that now burns under Réunion. These were the signatures of a globe that moves and breathes in heat and pressure. They left no room for a stable and hospitable Lemuria in human memory. Much of this science was conducted like a detective story, told in patient voices. A set of figures, mostly men, though not only men, conceived instruments that could read the ocean in ways that sailors with lead lines could not. They lowered seismographs and listened for the sound of the earth ringing with earthquakes. They laid cables and learned that signals traveled differently along the seafloor, depending on temperature and salinity. They took cores and saw the rain of shells of tiny plankton write climate cycles in chalk-thin bands that proposed a calendar. They compared these calendars across oceans and saw that the planet kept time in unison. This ability to count the past changed the tenor of argument. In a world of guesswork, a story like Lemuria can stand on confidence alone. In a world of dates and processes, it must find a place where it fits. It did not. As this knowledge settled into textbooks and museums, another tribe told stories that needed no maps. The tribe preferred mysteries to methods. They set cameras upon ancient sites and asked questions that sounded like proof to audiences who had not been given the patience to follow a core log. Nan Madol in Micronesia, a marvel of basalt columns stacked into walls and canals, was lifted into the Lemurian repertory by writers who had read Churchward and preferred him to archaeologists. The stones were moved by engineers who used leverage, rollers, canoes, and an understanding of water that comes from living every day upon it. The work was entirely human. Yonaguni off Okinawa became another talisman. Blocks of sandstone shaped by currents and joints were filmed by divers and presented as city steps underwater. The Bimini beach rock in the Bahamas went through the same cycle, though that belonged to the Atlantic and Atlantis rather than to the Indian Ocean and Lemuria. In every case, when the best observers went with the best tools and the longest patience, the explanation sat on the table like a polished stone. Nature and people had done what nature and people can do, which is more than enough. One can still stand at a railing on an ocean-going ship and feel the pull of the older thought. Night presses close, the wake glows, dark shapes appear and vanish on the horizon. It is not hard to picture a coast. Our ancestors filled such spaces with islands of the blessed, with lands that had once been but now are remembered only by mists. Lemuria was a late and learned version of that habit of mind. What the new science did was to show that the sea carries its own archive. It is not only a mirror of the sky, it is a library of basalt and magnetic stripes and microfossils. The archive had never been opened properly. Once opened, it talked. To tell this story without leaving the realm of the Indian Ocean would be unfair to the people who turned a set of arguments into a unified field of knowledge. In North America, Europe, and Japan, research groups in the 1950s and 60s hammered out pieces of a puzzle that snapped together with an audible click. Harry Hess in Princeton imagined the sea floor as a convective system and spoke of spreading centers. Robert Dietz used the crisp language of a naval officer to make the same point. Vine and Matthews in Britain showed how the magnetic stripes could be read as an arithmetic of spreading. Tuzo Wilson in Canada gave the world transform faults and a picture of plates that could slide past one another without destroying the whole. The Benioff and Wadati zones that marked deep earthquakes under arcs showed the paths where old ocean crust dove back into the mantle. Marie Tharp turned numbers into mountains and valleys. Bruce Heason accepted the Rift Valley he had doubted and helped publish the suspended blue map that now hangs in classrooms. The work felt at times like the steady reveal of a magician's trick. The audience gasped with every card that came face up, though there was no trick in it at all. There was only the earth revealing its habits to anyone patient enough to ask with instruments rather than insist with imagination. In India itself, the new story found champions. Geologists traced the Deccan traps across the peninsula and read in their layers the tale of a plume that had raged as the subcontinent hurried north. They followed the broken line of the Eastern Ghats and the Western Ghats and tied them to the breakup of Gondwana. They found in the sedimentary basins along the coasts the record of the sea moving in and out as land rose and fell. They taught students that the ridge to the west was not a ruin of Lemuria, but a factory of crust. At sea, Indian research vessels mapped trenches and banks and learned that the Laccadive Ridge was aligned with the track of the Reunion plume as the plate moved, an arrow written in basalt. Madagascar added its own pages. The island's western margin carries sediment that settled as Africa and Madagascar parted in the Jurassic. The eastern side bears marks of later encounters with plumes and currents. The subfossil bones of giant lemurs and elephant birds tell a story of isolation that is old but not beyond living memory. People reached the island by canoe and carried with them a language that binds the island to Southeast Asia as surely as its geology binds it to Africa and India. In that double heritage lies a better romance than the one that Lemuria offered. The sea is not a wall, it is a path. A canoe can carry a people farther than a land bridge built by the imagination. For a brief time, a small comfort remained for those who loved the idea of lost continents. The discovery of microcontinents like Mauritius seemed to say that something of the old legends had a core. It is wise to let the comfort be felt and then to separate the wires. Yes, remnants of old continental crust lie under parts of the Indian Ocean. They are ancient splinters, not platforms. They last because they are stuck in a web of stronger and younger basalt. They do not rise to form wide green plains where cities can bloom and then vanish in human time. They are the bones of Gondwana, buried under the ocean's restless skin. By the time the World Ocean Floor map was hung in classrooms, a teacher could point at the ridges and say to a child that the Earth is alive with slow movement. The lesson had a moral that never needed to be spoken aloud. Before you summon a vanished land to solve a problem, ask the planet how it works. The answer may empty your myth, but it will put a better wonder in its place. The ridges are factories of stone. The trenches are ovens where old crust returns to heat. The continents are rafts that wander with a dignity that borders on comedy when one remembers how small we are. The animals carry their stories on their backs. The plants refuse to lie. The sands at the bottom of the sea are calendars, patient and accurate. Some evenings, in a lab where cores are stored in long white trays, a researcher will run a fingertip across a change in color and see a season written in clay. The room hums, the fluorescent lights buzz. Outside, a wind comes over the parking lot and rattles a loose sign. Inside, a very old story moves forward by one more line. The researcher thinks of a paper by a quiet 19th century zoologist who drew boundaries for the living world and then drew a continent where there was water. The kindness owed to such a mind is to understand why it did what it did, and then to let it go. The kindness owed to the sea is to keep listening when it speaks. The mountain that collected the story was already a presence before any legend touched it. Mount Shasta rises out of the northern California plain like a statement. Snow clings to its shoulders in months when the valleys are brown. Springs run cold and clear at its base. The first peoples in its shadow spoke of spirits that walked the slopes and moved the weather with a will of their own. In the last years of the 19th century, a different kind of visitor arrived with trunks of books and a taste for the grand conjecture. With them came a name that had drifted for a generation across salons and journals: Lemuria. The thought that an ancient people had once lived on a continent swallowed by the sea needed a stage on land where a person could point and say that the survivors keep watch here. The mountain was ready to be chosen. In the summer of 1894, a young man in Eureka wrote a book that would outlive him in the strangest ways. Frederick Spencer Oliver called it A Dweller on Two Planets. He said it had come through a form of automatic writing that laid out a vision he never could have summoned by conscious design. The book told of a city beneath Mount Shasta where survivors of the ancient world had built halls and chambers of polished stone. They called the city Telos. The men and women of Telos kept knowledge that the surface had lost. Their machines did not smoke. Their lights did not burn. Their power ran through vibrations that passed through the earth like a quiet river. Oliver wrote with a confidence that disguised the audacity of his claim. He treated a subterranean civilization as if it were a matter of urban planning and etiquette. For readers who were ready to be convinced, the precision felt like proof. A few years later, a different voice gave the story a new thread. An American mystic named Harvey Spencer Lewis visited California as part of his work to revive a form of Rosicrucian philosophy for the modern world. He wrote under the name Wish-R-S, Serve, and in 1931 published Lemuria, the Lost Continent of the Pacific. The book gathered older speculations and gave them a measured tone. Lewis did not claim to have found a door into the mountain. He did assert that ancient records and persistent rumors pointed to a people who had carried their culture from a drowned land to safe places on high ground. In his telling, Mount Shasta became a sanctuary in a network of sanctuaries. He wrote of Atlantean and Lemurian wisdom as branches of a single tree, and of priests who had learned to guard knowledge through cycles of destruction and renewal. The effect was to lift Oliver's vision out of pulp romance and set it beside older esoteric traditions. Readers who would not trust a tale that arrived through a trance might trust one that arrived in the sober dress of a lodge manual. The decade that followed brought a different kind of visitor to the mountain. Guy Ballard had been a mining engineer who knew the feel of rock. In the early 1930s, he climbed on Shasta and later wrote that he had met an ascended master named Saint Germain on the slopes. Ballard's books, published under the name Godfrey Ray King, described a set of encounters that became the foundation of the I Am movement. The I Am discourses spoke of a hierarchy of masters who instructed chosen students in the use of divine decrees and the power of the spoken word. Ballard did not dwell on Lemuria as a chapter title, yet the mountain that the movement loved had already been prepared by Lemurian rumor. In meetings and conventions that filled halls from Los Angeles to Chicago, the language of ascended masters fused with the older story of hidden cities. When pilgrims came to Shasta to meditate, some expected to meet Saint-Germain on a trail. Others listened for the footfall of Lemurians in the timber at dusk. The press did its part to enlarge the story. Regional newspapers found in Shasta a steady source of copy. Each summer, a new report appeared of a tall robed figure seen in the trees, or of a column of blue light on the mountain that moved against the wind, or of a shopkeeper who sold a crystal to a woman who said she had spoken with a priest from the city below. The mountain town of Mount Shasta learned how to welcome the trade without mocking the visitor. Postcards carried images of the peak under winter stars. Notices for conferences promised sessions on earth energies and personal transformation. The people who hiked to Panther Meadow and drank from the spring carried plastic bottles, and a sense that the earth itself was a vessel of secret currents. While Shasta became the American capital of the Lemurian dream, a school took shape far to the south that gave the dream an orderly syllabus. In 1936, Robert D. Stell founded the Lemurian Fellowship in the Midwest, and soon afterward moved it to California near San Diego. He wrote a set of lessons called Lemurian Philosophy and gathered students who were willing to study by correspondence and gather for instruction in person when they could. The fellowship spoke in a voice that would not have been out of place in a business college. It taught ethics and practical skills alongside teachings about a high civilization that had once existed and that might be rebuilt if enough people learned the old way. Members advanced through degrees. They learned a vocabulary of laws that governed the universe and the personality. They were told that the ancient people of Lemuria had discovered those laws and had set down examples of governance that could be adapted to a future age. If the story at Shasta had the romance of a hidden door, the fellowship had the charm of a ledger and a plan. Across the country, a different stream of tales ran through a magazine that loved the border between science and spectacle. In the middle years of the 1940s, Amazing Stories published a series by Richard Shaver that told of ancient underground races at war beneath our feet. Shaver spoke of the Deros, a people who used strange machines to torment the surface with rays, and of the Teros who opposed them. The details were wild, and the editor Ray Palmer turned the volume up to sell issues. The Shaver Mystery, as the feature came to be called, pulled letters from readers who claimed to have heard voices from the tunnels at night or to have seen entrances in remote places. The setting of these tales moved from Appalachia to the American West and beyond, but the current ran back into Mount Shasta, often enough to keep the mountain in the national imagination as the mouth of a vast storehouse. The earlier vision of Lemurian halls could be read beneath the louder language of ray machines. People who distrusted occult books read amazing stories without shame. The legend adapted to their diet. Outside the United States, the same hunger for a tangible sign of the ancient world found other mountains and other springs. In South America, the name Telos traveled to the Andes and attached itself to stories of cities under Mount Illimani and Mount Aconcagua. In Japan, rumors grew around islands off Okinawa, where divers explored a stepped sandstone terrace called Yonaguni that looked to some like carved platforms and to others like ordinary geology. In Micronesia, the basalt walls and canals of Nan Madol drew film crews who spoke breathlessly of megaliths and forgotten engineers. Churchward's books on Mu had primed audiences to read any impressive stonework in the Pacific as a message from the drowned motherland. When cameras found Mount Shasta again in the 1970s, they brought with them the wider catalogue of global marvels and asked whether a single story might unite them. Lemuria itself gained a new set of objects that could be held in the hand and sold across a counter. In the last years of the 20th century, dealers began to offer crystals called Lemurian seed. The story ran that miners in Brazil had found quartz points in certain pockets that were not embedded in the host rock as usual, but lay loose as if set aside. The points carried fine horizontal striations and sometimes a blush of pink. Sellers said that the ancient people of Lemuria had programmed these crystals with knowledge before their land was lost, and that the crystals had resurfaced when the age was ready to receive them. Workshops taught students how to read the grooves like a script by running a finger along the face of the crystal in meditative attention. The geological details were ordinary. The marketing was skillful. In mineral shows from Tucson to Tokyo, a customer could ask for a Lemurian and be shown a tray with a price and a story attached. Other authors folded Lemuria into wider maps of wisdom. Max Freedomlong wrote in the 1940s about a secret science that he said he had found among Hawaiian kahunas. He called it huna and tied it to an ancient mother culture that sounded a great deal like a cleaned-up version of Mu. Edgar Cayce, the American trance reader who spoke often of Atlantis, mentioned Mu in passing and described migrations across the Pacific that preserved part of the old knowledge. Later, channeled works in the 1980s and 90s gave Telos a full court of characters and a municipal calendar. The city grew more ornate with each retelling. Some authors described a council chamber beneath a mountain where representatives of star nations met to plan a new era for the planet. Others offered practical advice from Lemurian teachers on diet, crystals, and the spiritual uses of sound. The reach of broadcast media made this a household vocabulary. Television series devoted to ancient mysteries placed Lemuria alongside Atlantis and the pyramids. A narrator would ask whether the colossal stone city of Nan Madol might be the work of a people from a lost continent, and then cut to a view of Mount Shasta under a red sky. A guest would say in ringing tones that survivors of Lemuria took refuge inside sacred mountains around the world and are now ready to share their teachings. Another guest would reply that the truth can be found in the latest finds of oceanography and archaeology. And then a map would appear that showed ridges and trenches, as if they were the poles of a magnet around which the modern mind must align. Viewers wrote down names, they looked them up, some booked flights. For the historian, the record of all this is surprisingly rich. City councils in the region around Shasta archived permits for gatherings that brought pilgrims by the hundreds. Small presses in California and Oregon printed booklets with maps of the mountain and essays on sacred sites. Rosicrucian periodicals kept letters from readers who described lights seen on the slopes and voices heard at night. The Lemurian Fellowship published a steady stream of lessons, and its headquarters near Ramona kept a witness tree on the grounds that students tended as if it were a small living archive of continuity. The paper trail does not prove an underground city. It does prove that for a century and more, people have ordered their days around the idea that the past is not dead and that the earth is a conversation partner. This chapter of the story also kept good company with the language of unidentified craft and visitors from beyond the earth. In the 1940s and 50s, reports of disc-shaped objects in the sky become a genre of their own. A few witnesses near Shasta said that the lights above the peak used entrances in the mountain to move unseen. In the 70s and 80s, there were groups that organized night watches and promised that meditation in a circle could summon craft that responded with flashes. The older idea of survivors in hidden halls beneath the earth and the newer idea of teachers from other worlds worked well together. One promised an ancient human wisdom preserved through ruin. The other promised a helping hand from outside the long human struggle. In the popular mind, the two joined hands on the snowy flank of a volcano and walked down into town for coffee. If one looks past the spectacle of gatherings and crystals, a quieter human story appears. People who had lost a church and missed it found in the Lemurian idea a liturgy of place. The mountain became a temple that required no doctrine. The springs were fonts. The seasonal return felt like a pilgrimage. A person could hike alone, sit among pines, and accept the sense that the past is not only a set of dates in a book, it is a presence. The image of a city under the mountain is an image of memory itself, which lives beneath conscious thought and rises in dreams. In the first years of the new century, a visitor to Mount Shasta could walk into a small shop on the main street and see the whole history in miniature. On one shelf were Rosicrucian reprints of Wish Our Serve. On another were paperbacks by authors who wrote as if Telos were a neighbor one might contact by letter. In a glass case lay a tray of quartz points with the fine rules across their faces. A map on the wall showed trails to the meadows where pilgrims gathered at sunset. The clerk had a practical manner and rang up the sale with the efficiency of a grocer. Above the register, a photograph of the peak took on the hue that film grants to snow at day's end. At Panther Meadow, on a late summer evening, one can watch this mixture of hush and commerce dissolve into something older. Families lay blankets. A man plays a flute with uncertain attention to pitch. A group sits cross-legged and chants quietly. Hikers return from the upper trail with cheeks red from the thin air. The sun goes down behind Castle Crags. For a moment, there is a shared sense that the mountain is doing what mountains have always done. It gathers people and gives them a horizon to look against. The stories change with the centuries. The need that draws them here does not. The air cools. The first stars show and then a few more. A child asks her mother whether the people in the mountains sleep at night. The mother says she does not know. The answer satisfies the child, who turns to the sky again and counts until she loses track. In a quiet map room after closing, an atlas lies open beneath a lamp. Its oceans shaded in deep blues that fade to pale along the continental shelves. The Indian Ocean spreads across 2 pages like a memory someone has tried to recover. Names flicker at the margins. Mascarene Plateau, Chagos Bank, Seychelles. A reader who knows the story cannot help but see in the water the traces of a proposition that began as an inference in a zoological paper, was adopted by a biologist with a taste for first causes, was transformed by a mystic into a chapter of sacred prehistory, was widened by popular writers into a motherland for every stone that puzzles the eye, and was then carried by national pride and occult hope into the new century to find a second life on a snow-crowned mountain in California. The life of Lemuria is not a single line. It is a braid of many fibers, each one drawn from a different human need. Historians like to watch the way an idea travels from one household to another and changes its clothes as it goes. In London in the 1860s, the clothes were those of careful science. Sclater measured and named, and the living lemurs and their cousins whispered a question about old geography that seemed to require a lost path. In Jena, the coat grew grander. Haeckel looked south and east, placed a cradle on a vanished platform, and invited ambitious students to find bones along tropical rivers. At Adyar, the garments were embroidered. Blavatsky and her circle stitched Lemuria into a vast tapestry of root races and cycles of earth that gave science a spiritual frame and gave spiritual longing a map with labels. Then came Le Plongeon and Churchward, who cut the cloth to fit a public that loved declarative sentences and maps in black ink. They drew Mu across the Pacific and declared that it gave birth to Egypt and the Americas, as if a single continent could be a parent to all later marvels. The garment kept its color even in climates where it did different work. In Chennai, it warmed the pride of a people who turned Lemuria into Kumari Kandam and placed their language and poets upon a southern land that the sea had taken. In Australia, it allowed novels and newspapers to imagine a pedigree for settlers and a condescension toward first peoples disguised as wonder. The same fabric reached the Andes, and the islands of Japan wandered into lodge rooms and crystals shows, and finally came home to rest in television studios, where narrators asked if the past might yet reach a hand from under the waves. To watch the braid is to notice how different communities made different bargains with truth. The scientist asked for mechanisms and dates, and asked them again when the answer was slow in coming. The mystic asked for meaning, and welcomed resemblances as if they were families reunited at last. The nationalist asked for origins and lifted up whatever tale could stand straight in a schoolroom and hold a child's attention. The entrepreneur asked for a clean story that could be placed on a dust jacket or on a card beside a tray of bright stones, and he kept a ledger that did not blush. None of these motives is small. They are the ordinary motives of a species that seeks explanation, belonging, hope, and livelihood. There is also the matter of how the earth answered when we learned to ask with better instruments. The long ridges that rise from the seafloor, the mirrored magnetic stripes that record the planet's field as surely as a diary records a day, and the cores of mud that keep a calendar in thin bands taught us that oceans are young in rock and old in water. Continental crust is buoyant and stubborn. Oceanic crust is made and unmade in cycles that leave little room for recent continents to have sunk intact within the memory of humankind. Yet the same discoveries produced a tidier truth that carries its own romance. India was once joined to Madagascar and to Africa, and scraps of that old union remain as microcontinents scattered under the sea. A name like Mauritius has the charm of a fable and the dignity of a paper in a journal. The real world could thus grant a small pardon to the dream. There were once broader bridges in very deep time. They belonged to ages measured in millions of years rather than in empires and poems. Between those scales, a second story unfolded that had less to do with rocks and more to do with minds. The appetite that keeps Lemuria alive is the appetite for pattern. Line up a lotus from Egypt, a sun disk from Mesoamerica, a serpent carved in stone from India, and the human eye will draw a line. Sometimes the line is warranted. Trade moves motifs. Sailors carry gods in their pockets as easily as coins. Sometimes the line is only the echo of how symbols arise in separate places to answer the same fears and hopes. A coil is how a river looks when it slows. A circle is how the sun looks when it sets. A staircase cut in a hillside is how people climb toward a sanctuary when their legs are strong and their air is thin. Churchward's genius was to gather such resemblances until they formed a pageant. His flaw was to declare the pageant a genealogy, and to insist that a drowned empire must sit behind every likeness. The modern taste for visitors from beyond the earth gave the old legend a peculiar buoyancy. If a person doubted that a prehistoric people could quarry and move great stones, the doubt offered two exits. One exit led to the workshop of masons and sailors where human methods are patient and surprising. The other led to the runway. To say that Lemurians were taught by travelers from the stars is to grant a simple dignity to the human wish that the cosmos might care enough to help. It also releases the storyteller from the duties of evidence. One can point at a terrace underwater off Yonaguni and invite a viewer to feel that intent chiseled it, even when the scars in the rock are the work of currents and fractures that take a patient hand to see. One can look at Nan Madol and say that basalt moved by song, when the song was in fact the rhythm of levers and rafts, and the competence that comes from lifetimes spent at sea. When a myth survives the corrections of science, it is because it has changed its work. Lemuria still names what was lost. It names land taken by water along coasts where subsidence and storm erase villages and fields. It names the destruction that follows eruptions in the Indian Ocean world, where ash has fallen on ships as if the sky had turned to paper. It names histories that were set aside by the larger empires that wrote their own versions of antiquity. In this sense, the myth keeps company with grief. It gives a language to communities that say a prayer at a shrine to a drowned city and leave a garland that the tide will carry away. That sort of truth is not geological, but it is not false. there is a less noticed chapter in which governments themselves admitted the charm of the old name. In the coat of arms of the British Indian Ocean Territory, a shield set with palm and crown carries a Latin motto that speaks of guardianship and an old ghost of a continent. The inscription calls Lemuria a charge to be kept. The phrase sounds like a private joke by heralds who had read their Victorian journals and knew how to nod to a vanished hypothesis while going about the dry business of administration. It is an emblem of how the 19th century lingers in the paperwork of the 20th and the 21st. A zoologist coins a term to explain a primate. A herald engraves a version of that term under a palm tree on a badge stamped in silver. Between them lies the unpredictable journey of an idea. Ask a teacher why the map of the seafloor matters, and she might say that it cured a habit of mind. Before the ridges were drawn and the cores dated, it was easy for anyone who lacked a mechanism to summon one in imagination. Land bridges appeared and vanished as often as a sentence required them. After the ridges, the earth demanded that a proposal earn its place. The same habit, properly tended, can help a reader of myths keep two truths in view. One truth belongs to the laboratory, the ship, and the quarry. The other belongs to the room where a grandmother tells a child that there was once a city where the sea now runs, and that the people there sang to the moon until the water took the streets. The cure is not to sneer at the second truth. It is to know which questions it can answer. On a coast road south of Chennai, fishermen push their boats over wet sand and out through the break. They lean into the sea as their fathers did. Behind them, school children carry posters that show temples by the water and speak of heritage. A boy has lettered Kumari in a steady hand along an imagined shoreline that extends into the blue. He has drawn a small compass, rows in a corner, and a flock of birds above the waves. He does not know the journals where Sclater wrote, or the plates where Haeckel labeled paradise. He knows only that the sea takes and gives, and that the story of what was taken teaches him something about what remains. Evening comes. The boats are dots on the water. The road gleams. The posters are rolled and tied with string.